Ian, let's start with you and with risk number one, no zero COVID. And this is specific to China. Why is this the top one in 22?
Yeah, well, I mean, the good news is that despite this massive case explosion with Omicron, the United States, Europe, the developed world is going to feel much more normal, finally, within weeks. But that is really not the case at all in China. The ability to live with the virus, an extremely easily transmissible virus that isn't as fatal, is the exact opposite of China's policy of zero COVID. And zero COVID will not work for them, but they're going to stick with it. And so that means that they are trying harder and harder to impose strict quarantines, which is going to have big impact on their economy. And it's not going to work well, but Xi Jinping can't back away from it. As you know, their vaccines don't work very well. They haven't had a lot of people with COVID so far, so they don't have a lot of antibodies in their population. And they're going to be fighting harder and harder over 2022 to deal with a strategy that looked the best in the world back in 2020. And this year, it's going to be the worst.
Yeah, it worked for at least a couple of months there. But Ian, what happens with China's economy doesn't just stay insulated to China's economy. This is the second largest in the entire world. How much do you think there is a risk of that being extended globally in terms of supply chain issues and just a slowdown in general?
I mean, the ability of the Chinese government, given that they're most important actor in the Chinese economy, to ensure that there's a stable level of growth for the Chinese domestic citizens is high. But if they're shutting down cities, and that will include significant amounts of production, you're going to have this, sort of spike and then pullback and spike and pullback, the kind that we felt in the United States and in the West over the past 18 months. Suddenly you get back in China. And of course, that means that we're going to continue to have supply chain challenges across the world in 2022. It also means that inflation has the ability to persist longer than you otherwise would have expected. This is a politically driven challenge. It's not primarily a virus-driven challenge, but it's one the Chinese government can't get out of their way on.
Elizabeth, economy, let me get over to you and ask about China's economic growth and strength, despite the zero COVID problems. Are they still expected to overtake the U.S. economy? Are they still expected to rule the world economically, so to speak?
Well, I think we've seen just in the past year that some of the economists have pushed the anticipated date for China's economy to be larger than that of the United States from about 2030 to 2033. Now you have people out there saying that they expect that it's possible that China's economy will never exceed that of the United States, that in fact it may fall prey to the middle income trap. One of the things that we need to be looking at also is how well China's managing out of this real estate crisis that it's experiencing right now. It's had the sort of Evergrande and Kaisa, but there are a number of other real estate firms in China that are equally sort of over-leveraged. And I think we should expect over the course of this next year to see that become an increasing problem for the Chinese government. Chinese people have about 70% of their overall wealth tied up in the real estate market. And this is I think this is a big problem for China moving forward. On top of the sort of COVID issues that Ian has just detailed, they've got a lot on their plates right now. This is going to be a very challenging year for them.
Exactly. I mean, they've got the common prosperity issue as well, which I think is fascinating to try and understand what's going on there. How do you read it, Elizabeth?
So common prosperity is really Xi Jinping's effort to redistribute wealth. China had become one of the most unequal, in terms of income equality, one of the most unequal societies in the world, as unequal as the United States, despite being, of course, a socialist country, which, is predicated on a fairly equal redistribution of wealth. So common prosperity is basically, let's take, from the rich to some extent and move to the poor, even though they're trying not to put it that way. But I think this is, an effort, again. China's got about $10,000 per capita right now. Xi Jinping has pledged that it's going to double again its income over the next 10 years or so. So this is an effort to try to make some progress on that. But we haven't seen Xi put in place the types of tax reforms and other kinds of reforms, structural reforms that we would anticipate to make this project work. And so that's what I think we need to look forward to see whether he can make that happen. But they have a lot of issues, a pension system that is, overburdened, an educational system that many middle-income people can't tap into, the demographics, which have gotten a lot of attention over the past year or so, are trending in very, very challenging ways for the government. Marriages have dropped by 40% since 2013. The divorce rate is skyrocketing, and they're having fewer children today than they've had at any point in the contemporary history of the People's Republic of China. That's 70 years, right? So that means that the number of young people, the most innovative and early adopters of technology, that group is declining in China, has been declining since 2012. So there are a lot of longer-term challenges that are now being built into this system that Xi Jinping is trying to wrestle with. But I haven't seen the types of structural reforms being put in place that are going to actually address those challenges.
Well, and Ian, to bring this back to you, risk number 4 is China at home. And you say in this report that domestic conditions within China won't undermine political stability. What about geopolitical stability and the relationship between China and the U.S., for example?
Well, frankly, that's the good news, and that's what you're not seeing on this report. It's not talking about the United States and China falling into a second Cold War that's been so fashionable in so many headlines. Look, the White House is completely convinced, given all of the challenges that Beijing is facing, and of course the fact that Xi Jinping is trying to secure and will secure his third term at the end of this year, that they don't want a crisis. In other words, it's not like President Putin and Russia that sees weakness and is pushing right now to see if he can grab something off of Ukraine and change the European security environment. And the Biden administration doesn't want, frankly, another foreign policy challenge before their own extremely difficult midterms coming up in November. So yes, we don't trust each other, and there are all sorts of areas that you're going to continue to see headlines because you don't have agreement on how we should move forward. It's the South China Sea, and it's Taiwan, and it's the treatment of the Uyghurs inside China, it's intellectual property, it's big tech, and the potential for a splinter net. But none of these things blow up in our faces in 2022 because the Chinese are incredibly focused on and incredibly challenged by this failure of their zero COVID policy. And frankly, the fact that Xi Jinping hasn't traveled anywhere since January of 2020 has hurt their diplomacy. This is a country that's been turning much more inward. Common prosperity that Liz Economy just talked about, absolutely it's trying to reduce the level of inequality in China. It's a Chinese populism. It's make China great again for average Chinese, but it's much less focused on Belt and Road. It's much less focused on China's projection of power internationally. And that's what we're going to be seeing more of in 2022.